Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars video. This is going to be my review for Star Wars Thrawn Alliances, the new novel by Timothy Zahn, which has just come out this week. And yeah, I'm going to be reviewing it today in this video. I'll start off with some kind of non-spoiler, more general thoughts, and end up with some more spoiler, what actually happens in the book thoughts. I'll let you know really specifically when that's happening, so you can avoid the spoilers if you don't want to see them. But yeah, first of all, what is this book and why should you be interested in it? Well, it's a Thrawn book, so it is the follow-up to the book that was released I think about a year and a bit ago, Star Wars Thrawn, which is basically the introduction to the character in the new canon. In that Rebels, I think for the most part, didn't really use the character all that well. I think he definitely added a bit of gravitas to the show as like being a solid villain. But he was never characterized all that well because he was always like the villain, and we never really got to see him as a character because they never focused on him. He was always just the guy who was opposing the rebels, and we didn't get the greatest sense of him. He definitely came across as smarter than everyone else, but you know, he definitely didn't come across as well in the show as he did in that novel. I liked the first novel a lot, and in a way I would say it is probably just about, I think, a better book than this, in that it feels a little bit more complete as a book, whereas this feels like it's let down a little bit with the plot for I think a good part of the book is not as interesting as it perhaps should be. I think they wait a little too long in Alliances to, I suppose, properly get you invested in the plot, and I think that's because it is a mystery. They set it up as like a mystery on both sides of the story. And I'll get into saying what I mean by both sides of the story in a second. But they set up a mystery, and it's only like in the last third of the book that they properly, I suppose, make it clear what's happening in both sides of the story. And you do definitely have a bit of a moment where you're like, oh, that, oh, I get what you mean now. And you care a bit more. But it just comes that little bit too late, where it was just kind of like, what was the book doing for like the first 2/3, apart from some of the character stuff, which was good? So it doesn't feel as, I suppose, plotted out as the first book. But the first book did have the benefit of, I suppose, properly introducing us to Thrawn, pairing him up with Eli Vanto, who was a new character who you really grew to care about as you saw his ascent through the ranks, I suppose, with Thrawn. And you almost like, he was, Eli in a way was the character you almost cared about a bit more because he was a bit more relatable, whereas Thrawn is such a kind of Sherlock Holmes type character in Star Wars that he's a little bit difficult to relate to even if he is characterized very well. Eli was exceptionally relatable, and then you had Yorinda Price as the sort of political plot and seeing how she gets from, you know, being part of this sort of notable family to being where she is in Rebels. So it is a bit more kind of compact, but it focuses really heavily on 3 character journeys and kind of completes them. This doesn't quite have that benefit because it is Thrawn after we sort of already know him. This is set after, I think, Rebels Season 3. So Thrawn has, you know, damaged the Rebel fleet, but he did fail to capture them, and that's kind of Vader's issue with Thrawn, I suppose, throughout most of the book, is that he didn't fully get the job done, even if he didn't, I suppose, technically fully fail. And the other thing is just, I suppose, that because I suppose the focus of this book, and in a way the gimmick is that, oh, look, you get to really see the interaction between Darth Vader and Grand Admiral Thrawn. Like, that's what the book is sort of sold on, whereas I'd almost say the book almost works a little bit better in reverse, kind of, where I could have almost see them promoting this as Anakin Skywalker there and Thrawn here, and it's more of a kind of flash forward in a way to what happens when he's Vader. But I get why they did it this way. Flashbacks are sort of easier to do, because I think the unique part of this book is that it is a kind of 2-stage story. Half of it is, yes, like the cover says, Thrawn and Vader going on a mission to this planet to investigate a disturbance that Palpatine senses. The other half is set in the past, and it's when Thrawn meets Anakin Skywalker for the first time, it's the same planet. So in the present day story, it is Thrawn and Vader returning to this planet they've both been to before, but for like a different reason. And the Clone Wars story, I think, adds a completely different dynamic to the story, because I don't think there's quite enough in just the present day story to have the book just stand on its own, in that you are chopping off, I'd say, like, you know, roughly I'd say like 3/8 of the book if you just get rid of the Clone Wars stuff. And I don't think it works as well. I think you need both sides to get basically the comparison between the relationship of Anakin and Thrawn to the relationship of Vader and Thrawn, and how Thrawn is like the constant in both of them because he is the same person, but he still does change as a character. He's different when he was younger to when he is now. And obviously Anakin is very, very different to Vader, even though they're the same person. And that is such a really cool thing to do. And they do it really well because they basically almost like repeat a conversation with Anakin and Thrawn. And then later on towards the end of the book, they have a similar conversation with Vader and Thrawn, but the like roles are basically flipped. In one, Anakin is the one who's like, oh yeah, we can get anything done, you know, like he's the classic kind of hotshot character. And then later on you see that Thrawn is kind of more like that, whereas like previously Thrawn was all like, we win, we get victory at any cost, even if we have to sacrifice something, and it's more Vader who's like that at the end of the book. So really, really cool dynamic there. And I'll keep saying it, but like, that, I think, is why you are going to be drawn to read this book, is to see that kind of dual interaction and how their dynamic over the course of the book goes. The plot, I think once you get to the end, is fine, and I enjoyed it enough. It's just, as I said, I think it takes a little bit too much time laying the mystery before you have enough information to probably get any sense of like really, okay, this is why we're here. Because I think with the Clone Wars story, you kind of, like, you're halfway through the book and you're kind of like, this just feels like a kind of, you know, average plot of a Clone Wars arc where like, okay, like droid factory on a far off planet, a little bit of intrigue, there's going to be a rescue mission here, there'll be a bit of a fight. There's no clones involved in here, so it's just a couple of hero characters. Cool, but like, that's really all that's going on, a standard Clone Wars mission. The present day stuff is I think probably where the plot, they're a bit too cautious with the plot initially, and it takes basically getting to the very end of the book to like be like, oh, so that's what they were going for the entire time. I really wasn't sure. And that's obviously that the setup for the book is like, as I said, Palpatine senses a disturbance in the Force on this very same planet that they'd previously been to, that where Thrawn and Anakin met, and he sends Vader and Thrawn there this time. And it's an interesting one because this is where the whole, Thrawn is from the unknown regions. He's a Chiss, from the Chiss Ascendancy. They're from the unknown regions. And he talked in the first book about like a threat coming from the unknown regions, and he was warning the Emperor about that. That comes up again, and in a way, that becomes like the big plot point coming out of the book. That's almost more interesting than what the plot of the book is actually about itself. The setup for what's coming next of like, there actually is a war coming from this specific species from the unknown regions, and we're not overly sure if we can deal with it while also fighting a growing rebellion. And that is a really cool dynamic to have here, where we know that we're in the middle of rebels, so we're deep in the middle of like the rebellion becoming this thing that the Empire can't just claim is this small group of rebels, that it's becoming this organized group of multiple cells that they can't fully deal with. And now all of a sudden there's a deeper threat coming from the unknown regions that Thrawn is basically the only one preparing them for it. Unfortunately, the book is only kind of really about that towards the end, and then right at the end kind of asks you to sort of look at the rest of the book and be like, oh yeah, so you learned a lot about the unknown regions over the course of this book, didn't you? here's what we were going for. And it's clever. It's just it definitely feels more like a sort of like a middle part of a larger story. And because we don't know if they're going to go fully into the whole unknown region story plot yet, it's a bit kind of like up in the air. Because one thing I will say that I don't think is too much of a spoiler is that they don't really reference the first book all that much. Like, because like the Price isn't in this one, Eli isn't in this one, so it's very much just Vader and Thrawn referencing primarily the stuff like Thrawn's kind of failure in Rebels Season 3. Which is fine, it's just, I think it makes it clear that there probably is at least one more story coming from Zahn covering what happens next. Now, how exactly did they do that? Obviously Thrawn, I think it's basically confirmed he's still alive, him and Ezra, like hyperspacing off with the whales and stuff like that. I think that it's implied they're still alive wherever they are. And potentially, if they've gone off crazy far, they could be near the unknown regions. It could be a case of like, those two have to team up together to stop an even bigger threat coming from the unknown regions. That would be a really cool thing to get, but it's also a fairly notable plot point, and I feel like you probably want to tell that in animation or a movie rather than just a book. But again, that's all about if they want to properly bring the unknown region as a plot point into more people's minds. Right now it is more of a book plot point. So, but because Ezra's involved, or kind of has to be involved, as well as Thrawn now that they've set up that he's sort of not killed fully, it's a weird one because you almost need context from this book to fully get it. But if they were to tell it in animation, I assume they would properly introduce what the unknown region actually is, but I digress. So, yeah, as I said, like, the strength of the book is the characters and the dynamic between Vader and Thrawn, and how, you know, Thrawn is obviously established to be like one of the smartest people in the Star Wars universe, that his tactics and what the insight he can gain from looking at little things, that's not even a skill that Vader as such has. And because of that, Vader like respects Thrawn for the incredible skills that he has. But he also doesn't want to indulge Thrawn for the type of character that he is, where he'll almost play games about these deductions, where instead of just getting to the root of like, just tell us the information we know and we can deal with it, you don't have to like ask me to figure half of it out and then you explain the rest. You could see the frustration coming in from Vader on those parts, but he also realizes how important Thrawn is at the same time. And one of the bigger plot points is that Vader is really trying to, get into Thrawn's head about what side is he properly on. Is he 100% loyal to the Empire, or is there still that glimmer of doubt that he's actually just primarily working for the Chiss Ascendancy, which they know about, and he's just going to turn and something's going to happen there before any of this kind of goes down. And that's another part of this book, is that the Chiss, and I suppose Thrawn's alliance to the Chiss, comes into play, and that's why the book is kind of called Thrawn Alliances, in that by the end of the book, you get Thrawn's answer to what side he's actually on, and it's somewhat surprising as well how they do it. And I suppose if there's potentially a link into the end of the first book, this is potentially where it is coming in. So I thought that was actually really well done. I don't feel there's a lot else I can particularly talk about before I get into spoilers. I suppose a little bit more on the Clone Wars side of the story. You do get Padme fairly heavily involved in that story, in that the Clone Wars era story happens because of her. She follows a kind of transmission from one of her former handmaidens out to this obscure planet to investigate this kind of basically separatist droid factory that's being developed there. And Padme's kind of out on her own for most of the book, and then Anakin is like the only one who knew that she was going. So he kind of follows up with that after a certain amount of time, because she effectively goes missing. And so this is all done like without kind of properly informing anyone official. So that's why there's no clones involved here. It's just, Padme, Thrawn, and Anakin basically involved in that side of the story. And it's nice to just get a book that is like fairly heavily Clone Wars focused, because that was one of the cool things from San Diego Comic-Con this year, is that we got the announcement that there's going to be a Padme book, I think focusing on her time as the Queen, dealing with that. So I'm actually pretty excited for that, because like I think some of the stuff with Plagueis, as well as I think 1 or 2 other novels, explored that a little bit, and it was actually quite interesting. And then more notably, I think they announced a Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Master and Apprentice book, so that's going to be very fun. I really like that they're bringing the prequel stuff back, and especially with the Clone Wars coming back for a final season, it feels like Disney are finally kind of being aware that, hey, people like the prequels in a way more than... like, the prequels are no longer the most controversial thing in Star Wars, kind of because of what's happened with like the sequel trilogy and the general direction of Star Wars. And them actually saying, oh, we're going to focus on the prequel for a bit, actually gets people excited. That was from like E3, the Battlefront stuff, Battlefront 2 stuff, bringing Clone Wars characters in. We got a huge announcement. You know, I was really, really excited to see Clone Wars be a big part of this. The show coming back, more books kind of set more in that era. It's all positive to me. So I'll move into spoilers now, because I don't feel there's too much else I can get into without talking about the details. Let's cover the Clone Wars stuff first. What actually happens here? So the idea here is that this other, this Duke from Sereno, so he knows Count Dooku, but he's not like that powerful, has started up this factory on this remote edge of the known kind of system, basically unknown region world. And basically it's revealed by the end of the book that what they're doing here is manufacturing new super battle droids that are made with cortosis infused into their armor. So they're very heavily immune to blaster fire and immune to lightsaber blows, which Anakin discovers, and they only manage to like defeat these things by like stabbing them in the eyes and kind of disabling their weapons and so on. So this is basically what prompts that by the end of the book they have to destroy this factory and this mine on this planet to stop the Empire basically getting undefeatable droids into play. The twist on this by the end, that they sort of in a way like double twist, is that they're not just, this factory is not just manufacturing droids with cortosis weave in the armor. They're also making clone armor that has the cortosis infused in it as well. And immediately when I read this, I was like, whoa, like, are they implying that, like, at this point, they were basically setting up for, like, I was kind of thinking, like, is this, like, prototype for what Stormtroopers are going to be? Or is this actually an early setup for Order 66? And by the end of the book, it is more confirmation that it is actually for Order 66. That this was a plan to distribute this armor eventually into the clone army, so that when Order 66 was executed, it would go much more smoothly than it actually did. And that the takeaway that I get from this is that if our heroes didn't destroy this factory here when they did, Order 66 would have gone even worse than it actually did. And potentially the characters that we know who survived probably wouldn't have. And I thought that was a really, really cool reveal that in just a slight twist on the story, turned it from being a kind of destroy another droid factory into, oh wow, this actually felt important, even if I think the overall story to get there and significance of the maybe book still isn't the most biggest. It was still a cool reveal to have of like, okay, cool, they're canonizing cortosis, and it was cool to see Anakin's reaction to like hitting one of these things and his lightsaber just turning off and having to deal with that. So that was really cool, I think, to see just the setup for that, and knowing that, like, okay, so this book explains why that ended up not actually happening in the way that we sort of expected it. And then the twist by the end, I think I have to explain the other part of the present day story before I get to, I suppose, the twist on both of them and how they sort of link them together, is that what the disturbance in the Force is, that is like the kind of setup for the book. Palpatine senses something out in this exact same place where Anakin and Thrawn met, and he sends Vader and Thrawn there to investigate it. And what it is that they basically find that the planet where this factory was, I think, or the planet before they kind of get there, has been basically borderline taken over by another unknown region species called the Grisk. And they've come in, they've kind of subdued this other unknown species, kind of called, I think, the Darshi or something like that, the Darshai. So the Grisk are established to be a fairly powerful kind of warrior race who've been able to really get a lot done. And they're beginning to move into, like, I suppose, the known galaxy. And what they've been doing is that we find out that they sort of have this unique technology where they can sort of block hyperspace routes by using these gravity generators that are kind of cloaked. And it's a big reveal when they figure out that this is how they were doing it. The other thing that they do to keep themselves secret out here on the edges of the galaxy is that they have a technology where they can actually move the smaller moons of this planet into the way of the hyperspace, in the way of the hyperspace lane, to block this all off. So that's kind of fundamentally what Vader and Thrawn are investigating, is this kind of disturbance, what they're doing here, but more specifically, why they are blocking off the hyperspace routes. And we find out that the main reason for this is that, okay, they have this pretty high-end technology, they're different. At a base level, they don't seem to be, like, that great of a threat, but then, I suppose, Thrawn's, like, cultural analysis of them, it kind of becomes clear of the way they operate, that they really do target what is important to another species and takes it away. And so how they've been able to have such a big advantage kind of before now is that they actually had stolen Force-sensitive children from the Chiss and were using them to sort of pilot their ships more carefully through hyperspace. Because Thrawn explains to us that the way the Force users within the Chiss works is different. It tends to manifest itself quite early, primarily in female Chiss, and it's really powerful, their precognitive abilities, but it sort of fades over time, and by the time they're adults, they have only the most minor of Force ability to sort of sense the future. So this is why it's the children of the Chiss, the future of the Chiss, that is being taken by the Grisk here. And this is the whole, like, alliances thing with Thrawn, in that Thrawn sort of figures out somewhat early in all of this that this is indeed what the Grisk have sort of taken. And so he's personally involved in this because he doesn't want these kids from his people, his species, to be captured. And he has to sort of prove over the course of the book that there's more reason for the Empire to be involved in fighting the Grisk other than just his personal reason of getting these children back. And you obviously find out that they're using it for this hyperspace use and they end up getting it back. But by the end, we kind of find out that it is this proper setup that the Grisk are kind of this true threat from the unknown region, and that they borderline are preparing for an attack against the Empire. And that Thrawn's actions towards the end of the book are going to give the Empire a chance to actually be able to prepare for what is coming. Because what he does by the end of the book, to prove to Vader that he is 100% on the Empire's side, is that when they defeat this initial kind of fleet of the Grisk and take back the children, Thrawn announces them in this sort of like victory speech that instead of announcing himself as like being from the Empire or anything like that, he announces himself by his full name, the Mithra, Mithra Nerundo. He calls himself by that. He calls himself by his like Chiss military rank and never specifies he's part of the Imperial Navy. So part of the Grisk's culture is that they always tend to attack the thing that is closest to them because they consider it to be the greatest threat. So Thrawn, in saying this, basically puts the target on the Chiss ascendancy rather than the Empire, who were the ones who were actually they were fighting with over the course of this book. So it's this kind of thing where he proves to Vader that he's on the Empire's side by giving the Empire this opportunity to prepare for battle against the Grisk, as they are more or less implied to be going into battle against the Chiss Ascendancy. And this is why I say this is where the Eli stuff comes into play, because by the end of the first book, Eli was kind of put into contact with the Chiss Ascendancy and he was going with them somewhere. So if there is a book about the Chiss Ascendancy battling the Grisk, I think that's where Eli will come back into play. And because of how much I liked him in the first book, I am really, really excited to see the return of that character, and to see the return of that character when he meets Thrawn again. That's what I'm very, very excited for. I think as I said, the only problem with this book is that it leaves a lot of these reveals until like very, very, very close towards the end of the book, which means that I'd say the first 200 pages or so are interesting enough. You're invested because Zahn's style of writing for Thrawn works. The character interactions between like Anakin and Thrawn, Vader and Thrawn, even like Padme and what she's going up to. It's all solid stuff. It's just you're not overly invested in the plot because you're not sure exactly what's going on, because they keep what's going on with the Clone Wars thing a mystery for a while, and you just think it's a random droid factory until, again, right towards the end of the book. And then in the present day story, you're really left in the dark about like, okay, there's this unknown species, but from the unknown regions, but what exactly are they doing here? They sort of track them here, there's a bit of a fight here. It's Vader and Thrawn arguing with each other, and then it is really only right at the end where it properly comes out that like, okay, yeah, I actually do consider them a proper threat, and it's more of a setup for what's coming next. So, in terms of final recommendations on this book, like, I'd say it is worth reading, with the kind of caveat that I think it requires you to really like Thrawn as a character to, I think, really get a lot out of this. If you do, you will probably like this book. If you like the Clone Wars and are really eager to see anything in the Clone Wars era, I think you'll like this book because you get Anakin, you get Padme, you get Anakin and Padme interacting with Thrawn. That's a really, really cool little setup. And there's lots of nice moments, nice character moments as you go through, as you get to compare, as I said, Thrawn and Vader's relationship to Thrawn and Anakin's. And I think the best scene that shows this in the book is that fairly early on, as Thrawn and Anakin plan their mission to rescue Padme, or just basically investigate what's going on, Thrawn basically says to Anakin, kind of sensing that, okay, this is the type of person that you are, victory is the most important thing. We have to be prepared to put that above all else, that we have to make sure the mission succeeds before anything else, even if that involves potentially not being able to rescue Padme. And Anakin is more like, no, we can get all of this done. We can win, we can get revenge against the people who took Padme, and we can save her. We can make all of this happen. And you contrast to a similar scene later on in the book between Vader and Thrawn, where all of a sudden Thrawn is the one who is like, I think we can do all of this. I think we can save the people of the Chiss. I think we can make it work for the Empire and work for the Chiss, work for all of us. And he's kind of the one, in a way, like, acting like Anakin would, where he's confident that they can get all of this done, kind of as if he has learned from Anakin to kind of be able to be like this, and not just focus on like victory by sacrificing everything else, but that there is a way to find a way to make everything happen. While Vader is now the one who is more like, we have to make sure the Empire achieves victory, and that the only thing we need to accomplish is the Empire's goal. So initially he's not kind of really caring about the Chiss children, or really is not happy about Thrawn doing anything that is like not just for the Empire. And I thought that was a nice comparison between like both sides of the dynamic that were going on here. So yeah, as I said, if you like Thrawn, it's a good book. If you like the Clone Wars, it's the first time we're getting to see some Clone Wars stuff in a while. And I think it overall works. Like, the book is unique in that it tells those two, stories of, like, here's these two relationships like 10 or so years apart. Here's a Clone Wars story and a between episode 3 and 4 story, both on the same planet but years apart, with actually a different plot point, a different issue at play. And that absolutely is fine. It's just there is a sense of like, it is not utterly riveting, action packed. The reveals take a good while to get there, but Thrawn is Timothy Zahn is a good enough writer that he just about keeps you invested the whole way through. So that's the way I describe the book. It feels like a solid like 7.5 out of 10 book, whereas I think the original Thrawn book was more of, I think, like an 8, maybe a little bit more, and a good step below what I consider to be some of the better Star Wars books, of like Darth Plagueis being like right up here, and then like the Darth Bane trilogy maybe just a little bit below, as being the top tier of Star Wars books. This is like in that similar region, but you know, the plot's not as strong. And I think that's perhaps been a thing with some of the more recent Star Wars books, is that the character stuff has always been fine. Like, writing a character book is good. Like books like Star Wars Ahsoka, A New Dawn, focusing on the Rebels characters at a unique time. That sort of thing. The Phasma book was good as a character book. But when they get into the plot and investing you and that sort of stuff, that's where some of the struggle has sort of come into play. But as I said, you know, I was very happy with this book. At times, reading long-ish books can sort of be a struggle for me in terms of just devoting the time to just sit there and read it. I obviously took 2-3 days to read that, but that's, for me, very good to get through like a 350-page book. So I'll give it credit for that. It absolutely held my attention throughout. So I would recommend it, but with the caveat that it's not going to blow you away with how amazing it is. In that the potential for like Vader Thrawn, it could have been amazing, but it falls a little bit short. But they're my thoughts on the book. If you've read the book yourself or are interested in it, let me know your thoughts on it in the comments below. But other than that, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.